Fun Podcast Network.
This podcast is brought to you by our friends at Linode. Whether you're working on a personal project or managing your enterprise's infrastructure, Linode has the pricing, support, and scale you need to take your project to the next level. Get started on Linode today by going to linode.com/remote-ruby.
This is Remote Ruby.
Have you any remote ideas to the meaning of the word?
How's it going?
Welcome back. Well, it feels actually a little weird because Andrew and I recorded yesterday on the Ruby Blend.
Oh, cool.
Feels like you were missing, but I was substituting on that podcast.
That was a good one.
Yeah, it was.
It was really good. We talked to Joel Husky, who is the maintainer of Vue Component. It was a great talk.
Yeah, it's definitely worth listening to. And one of those libraries to check out for sure.
Anything else going on? Anything exciting?
I wrote a TypeScript Gatsby site last night.
Oh, yeah?
Rails.fm. It actually went better than I thought it would. I had this expensive domain that I bought when I was intoxicated one night for some stupid reason. And I was like, oh, I'm going to do something with this. And then I never did. And then I was like, this is costing me way too much money to not do something with it. So I wanted to get that shipping dopamine hit. So threw up a quick thingy, just got it out there.
I saw that it's going to be a podcast repository kind of thing or list of Rails podcasts.
Yep. That's literally what it is. But it's kind of cool because there's a data.json file or something, podcast.json file in there. And all you have to do is add in that information and it uses GraphQL to slurp it up at build time and then create the cards.
Oh, that's pretty cool. Is it doing that when it renders or is it
on build?
On build. Yeah. Cool.
It hydrates the pages.
That's one of the promises of Gatsby though, right? Use any data source and it'll just pull from it at build.
And I was going to just paste it all in the HTML or JSX. But getting that data thing working, it took 5 minutes.
Wow, that's
surprisingly. I was very surprised.
For something in JavaScript, it only took 5 minutes?
Yeah, I know. It blew my mind. I did a fist pump. I'm like, yeah.
Dude, that's awesome. I'm going to have to try it out. I'm still just use Jekyll whenever I need a static site. Still use it. Not much has changed there for me.
Same. All day, every day.
Well, this episode, we have a special guest, Steve Polito. You want to introduce yourself?
Yeah. So thanks for having me, guys. I appreciate it. So I'm a 30-year-old self-taught web developer. I went to school originally to do graphic design, but I was more interested in the web design aspect of things. And the college I went to didn't have computer science or a real web development course there. So when I first started learning out, I was it was Dreamweaver and tables. That's how I learned. Turns out that tables aren't really a good way to make websites. Found that out after a year or two. So we had directed studies at the college I went to. And from there, I just sort of started piecing together the correct way to build websites. But I was more or less on my own in that process. And then I was fortunate enough to get a job at an agency after I graduated. And I was kind of in a sink or swim situation where I knew HTML, I knew CSS, I knew the very basic fundamentals of web development, but I did not know much more beyond that. And the agency that I got the job for, they did a lot of Drupal development. And Drupal is a open source CMS, kind of like WordPress, but it's more used for government and educational websites. And a lot of people think it's really complicated, and it is really complicated, but it also has a GUI for building out complicated queries. So I was actually able to make fairly complicated websites early on in my career using Drupal, but I did not know what was going on. And I only knew how to build things in Drupal. So if you asked me to build whether it was like a simple marketing site or like a complicated directory website, the only tool in my tool belt was Drupal. And then I would just use modules, which is kind of like the same concept as like a gem or like a plugin in WordPress. I would just look for things that already existed that someone already made and throw those together and just hope that I could find a module that would meet my needs. And then I would just, skin it with custom styles. So that was like my bread and butter for a while, but I wanted to make things, I didn't want to be confined to just Drupal. I wanted to do web applications and software. And fortunately I stumbled upon Rails and I was like, oh, this is what I've been looking for. Like this allows me to do whatever I want. And then just through a variety of resources like the Rails tutorial, Rails casts, Go Rails, obviously, a combination of all those resources, I was able to be confident enough to actually build applications in Rails. But so I'm sort of at like a crossroads in my career where I'm really confident in like the agency work. Like, right now, I mentioned Drupal, and now we do a lot of WordPress. We also do Jekyll and Gatsby too. So I'm confident with those things, but I'm not really passionate about them. I'd rather just do software development. But the problem for me is I'm the only developer at my agency. So it's hard for me to learn from someone. And also I'm only doing agency work. So even if I had someone else to work with, we're just, at the end of the day, we're just churning out like marketing sites. So I've given myself a few personal projects, one of which is simplesitestatus.com, which I was pumped that I was able to snag that domain. And all it does is it just emails you if your site is down, and it takes a screenshot of your site every day. So there's nothing new about this particular website. There's plenty of sites that do that. But it was a good way for me to really learn Rails beyond just making like a simple CRUD application. But like, because for example, I used the VCR gem to record the API requests because I'm using a third party to take the screenshot to third party API. So like there's a few external resources I'm using. So and I practice RSpec with that too. Before I've gone back and forth with mini tests and RSpec, but with that project, I was practicing using RSpec. So that's probably my most complicated Rails project that I've made. But again, these are all like personal projects. I've never worked on a team. I've never worked on anything that needs to scale. And I just feel like I represent the developer they want to go from agency life to software development, but it's sort of like a catch-22 because I have like enough experience probably to get my foot in the door and have an interview. But then if I was given like I've been given coding challenges before, like, writing algorithms and stuff. And I'm like, I don't know how to do this. Like, this is not really practical for me. So that's kind of where I am. It's just in a crossroads.
I can relate to that like super duper well, because that was the same when I graduated and got my first like Rails job. It was for an agency. All of the work we did was for like design agencies in St. Louis. So like, yeah, we built, what was it? Justin Timberlake's tequila website and things. And it was like, yeah, the
Tequila 901.
Yeah. 901 tequila. Yeah.
That's after the Memphis area code.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Justin Timberlake's from Memphis. So
that's awesome. Yeah. We built that website. I worked on like the Hardee's mobile app and stuff, but it was always like, those are more the complicated things I got to do, or like a Facebook game or something for the Super Bowl for a grocery store and whatever. But they were like, you build it, you launch it, you never touch it again. And you like, don't get any, it's like in school, you don't get any like most of software development is maintenance, right. You don't get to do that in agency life because you're just getting paid to like go build something new, launch it, and then we'll throw it away in, 6 months or whatever. Or it's simple and we don't need to ever touch it again.
Right.
Kind of thing. It's frustrating.
Pretty
in a way.
Exciting agency life though. Those are some pretty interesting projects. Mine were all just like small, like restaurant just opened up. We need a WordPress site.
Yeah. We had some of that too, but we did have a few that were like pretty sweet. Yeah, I think when you're talking about building, it feels like it's already been done before, building a site monitoring service. I just wanted to say the thing that always taught me the most was spending time cloning stuff that already existed so I could figure out how they made the decisions to build the product they did. If you want to go clone anything, really, you have to figure out how did GitHub actually interact from the website with the Git repository on the server, Like you may not be doing it at the same scale they are where they have to store tons of files. You do now have to think about how does Rails actually talk to Git and get a list of files and folders and whatever else, the recent commits and all that stuff. I think building stuff like that's a great way to teach yourself and challenge yourself in a way that's like practical in a sense. You may not have someone to mentor you every day, but in a sense, you're like looking at these other products people have built and it's able to mentor you because you can compare how yours works compared to that. I thought that was a cool, a good way of doing things.
Yeah. And it also helps too, like when you're building something you're going to use and that you're interested in, it's more motivating. So another application I'm working on now, and again, this is just a personal project, but it's kind of like a watered down Notion. So I just want to make something that I can have tasks, like, a task manager, write notes, and have reminders, those three things. And like, I know how I can do it. And obviously the idea behind that is not very novel. Like there's a million applications that do that. But yeah, like you said, it helps me think, how do these other applications build these things? And how does like mine stack up to it in terms of the architecture? And I have a few questions on that app, if you don't mind me asking. And they're kind of conceptual. So
yeah, let's hear it.
I have a task model. The task model has many task items. So that's one thing. And then I want to have a reminder model, but then I thought maybe I also want to have the ability for an individual task item to have a reminder attached to it. So like a reminder by itself would be more like, oh, hey, like you get like a birthday party coming up next week. Like that's not really a to-do item. It's just a reminder. But then if on your to-do list, you might have something that is time sensitive. It needs to happen on a particular day. So, I mean, I know I could just, on the task item model, I could just have like a remind me at column or something, and it would just be like a date time. But I just started reading Sandy Metz's OOD book. So now it's making me like, and I just scratched the surface. So a lot of it's still like, I get what she's trying to say, but I haven't really practiced enough of it. But now it's making me think like, should I have some type of like polymorphic relationship or something where like I make a reminder model and then a task item is remindable? I don't know. And like, I mean, and that's one thought. And then also like, does that scale well if there's like, if a task has like 50,000 task items, and I don't know, so before I even started implementing that, I stopped and thought about like, how are these relationships going to work now, but also like a year from now.
So I dropped a video, link to a video in the chat. At RailsConf last year, David Copeland gave a really good talk that I went to called Database Design for Beginners, and I would totally check that out. And one thing I will say before I let Chris actually answer you is that there are a lot of thought leaders, quote unquote, and I think you could lump Sandy Metz in there. But just because she says something doesn't necessarily mean you should implement it, because she says a lot of really great things, but actually implementing them is like something different, I guess.
Sure.
That's an interesting point too, because I feel like, I don't know, I see this a lot with people who they want to learn design patterns and things, but it's like you can learn the patterns, but then actually knowing when to apply the pattern is the real hard part. The pattern itself isn't hard.
Yeah.
And then you often see stuff shoehorned into things. Whereas like, I didn't even know when I was teaching myself, like, I didn't even really know what a design pattern was. And over time, I solved enough problems that I saw like these things were being repeated. Like, oh, I could do this in that way again and apply this idea from a different project. And then kind of like the design patterns emerged. And then you understand like really when they can apply. I mean, that's probably going to be one of those things that you will want to apply to this sort of thing. Because when you're designing something like reminders like this, I would think about, you have tasks and you have task items and stuff that you might want reminders on, but you also might want like generic reminders or whatever. But then at some point, you might also want other things that need reminders, like a calendar event if you decide to add that feature. So then you start to think about, you don't want to try and solve every problem from the very beginning, but you do want to have an idea of like, well, we'd like to do this in the next year or something. And maybe we design it now with that in mind, because otherwise you're like, oh, well, we need to scale this. Let's use Kubernetes, and we never build the product in the first place.
Right.
But, you can always do that where you can imagine where you're headed, try and bite off a chunk of that now and just forward thinking. If it's not too far out that you can understand it. But then at the other end of the spectrum, when I got my first Rails job, the project that I did was I built an app almost just like this, actually. It was a to-do list, and I intentionally wrote it as naively as possible so that I could learn how to like preserve the production data and move it around in the database when I needed to add reminders or new models and stuff. And you can always go that route too. Start very simple. Throw your column, remind me at column or whatever. And then like do that on purpose and refactor it out to some other model over time or something. That might be a great way to like force yourself to learn a few other things too along the way, because almost every application is going to have those moments. Yeah, well, we designed this pretty simple before, and now we have a new requirement that we got to go do, and we have to re-architect the database a little bit to add that, new association or something. And those are especially good. You didn't over-optimize at the beginning when you didn't know we don't really know what other things we want to add reminders to. So let's not try and over-engineer it yet. We'll figure it out as we go. So it kind of depends a little bit, but that's probably the direction I would go with it, is just either make it, if I know I'm going to add reminders, or if you know today that you need reminders for task items and tasks, and you want like generic reminders, then yeah, just build it polymorphic right now, because then you can do it so you can attach it to any of those items, or you could leave it where it's unattached to anything, and that could be a regular reminder not related to anything.
Cool.
That'd be simple enough.
Yeah.
Yeah. You could also go the other route and like add the reminders on each of your models. Just do that for practice to extract it out or something too.
Yeah.
Could be fun.
Cool. And then kind of stemming from that, so I have a users column, users model, not column, users table. And, a user can have many nodes, they can have many reminders, etc. And I'm not sure what I want to do with this app in the future. Like maybe I'll make it a SaaS app or something, because this is going to blow Notion out of the water. Everyone's going to be using this. And I was just like thinking, well, down the road, if this is a SaaS app or something, like a one way to make it worth paying for is like, well, if you're using the free version, you can only have, let's say, 100 notes. If you're paying me, you can have unlimited notes. So one idea I have now is, we'll use notes as an example. Should there be a notes limit column on the users table with like a default value of, let's just say 100. And then once they have a subscription, it updates that value on a per user basis to like, nil or like 1,000 or, it'll just affect the number depending on that person's subscription. Or like maybe that person's my best friend and I just want to give them like on an individual basis, just give them like a specific number of notes. But, someone else joins, maybe I have a grudge against them and I'm like, you're going to have 2 notes. That's all you can add. So I don't know like what the pros and cons of having that association tied to the user is.
Yeah. A lot of times what I would do is like put it on add a plan model or something. Cause like in Stripe, you're going to have a plan anyways. And then you can, if you ever decide to change that amount, like you want to add some, you're not likely to take it away or whatever. But, if you do add some, you can just apply it to every user with one record change, which is kind of nice. When you're wanting to do the one-off stuff, you can just like add a unique plan for your friends or whatever. Like in Jumpstart Pro for admins, we have like a fake plan that's a Jumpstart plan that the admins get assigned and they're like treated as if they're subscribed without having to add a credit card or anything. When it comes to that, yeah, if there's something that is, you're probably going to want to have exceptions. That's like the minimum, that will certainly be needed. That is something you could do on the users, but when it's like probably going to be the same for every user, except for a couple of exceptions that are probably like, you're going to have them infinite notes allowed or whatever. Like you can have 2 plans. One is hidden, so no one can sign that up for that or whatever. And then like you have a nice, easy place to manage that for everybody rather than like doing it on every individual. But if there was ever a case where you might have a different limit per person or something, then yeah, it might be better on like eventually you might want to charge like per note or something where your subscription is like just counting your quantity of notes and just charging, $1 per note or something, that kind of is something that seems more related to the like subscription plan that they're paying for more than the user itself. So I find it kind of helps to extract that out to its own concept of like a plan. Then you can reason about it a little bit better as you're working on it.
Yeah, that makes sense. And thanks for walking me through that. Because that's a good point. Like, let's say by the grace of God, I get like 100,000 people to sign up for my awesome new application, right? And then I decide like, oh yeah, you know what? I think people should be able to have 500 notes to start off with. Then I would have to update 100,000 records versus just updating one record for the plan model. So
yeah, and you're just more likely to make a mistake or something when you're updating 100,000 records rather than one, and then it's just kind of, it's also just duplicate data that doesn't really matter, So the same thing goes for GoRails. Like I have a handful of like teams and there's like university or something that I have a special plan for. And a few people have contacted me, asking for something that's different than my regular like team plans. So those I have just hidden plans that no one knows about that I like manually assign in the database. And they have different limits, and it works out really easy. So I have 50 different plans or something for those like 49 unique cases or whatever. But my base plan is always in there too.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's probably how I would treat it.
Okay. Appreciate that. Yeah. And I guess we'll go with the example of like, let's just say I had to update 100,000 records in the database, right? What do people think about when you're writing a migration, also manipulating data within that migration? Because I've seen it in the Rails API or like the Rails guides. So like, I know it's a thing you can do. And I personally have done it myself, or like maybe I'm dropping a column on a table and I'm adding a new column to a new table, but I want to migrate that data to that other table. And I've done that in the migration. And I think I've accounted for migrating up and down in there. But like, I've also read that should be abstracted into like a temporary task. And I don't know the pros or cons to either of those situations.
So I have, unfortunately, a lot of positive and negative experience doing migrations, data migrations specifically. One of my biggest errors I ever made in my career was a botched data migration. So it's been kind of instilled in me and frowned upon to like do actual data migrations in your database migrations. And like, I think a good argument for that is like if you, I don't know, I'm just pulling a random model out. Let's say your app knows about a task. And so you say like task dot update all, and then you go and delete the task model like 2 months later, and you try and run those migrations from scratch. It's going to try and migrate against a model that it doesn't know about anymore.
Okay.
So there are a couple of good options. And I think when you say task, I assume you mean like writing a rake task to do those migrations.
Yeah, that's what I've read anyways. But yeah, a rake task.
Yeah, so rake task is always a good option because like you can define what you want to do and it doesn't run every time you run your migrations. There's a gem I implemented at work and it's still a hot topic because some people I don't think like it, but it's called the data migrate gem. And what it does is it actually creates, it's in your DB folder. I think it's called data, and it uses the Rails database migration structure, but it's meant to just be for like migrating data over. And so I like that a lot because it gives you a command called Rails DB migrate : with data. And so it'll actually in sequence run those.
Cool.
The other thing about that I recommend though is if possible, try and write data migrations in SQL. If you're doing that in such a way that you're trying to avoid like writing the model, like hard coding a model in a migration, if you can just write SQL, it's usually, depending on your database, like at work, it's quicker for me to write a SQL migration to run because it's a lot quicker than looping through 100,000 records and updating them.
So I'm like a chump and
Sure.
I'm a basic. So it's funny. I don't really know what I would call myself in terms of a developer. Like I'm not really a junior dev because, well, I'd like to think I'm not a junior dev. Maybe I am because I've been working in the industry for 8 years. But then you talk about writing SQL and I'm like, oh boy, I don't even like, honestly, if I had to do that right now, like if I had 10 minutes to do that, isn't there like a Rails helper where you can just like do like dot to SQL or something? Like I'd probably do that locally,
Right.
Copy and paste whatever that was, hope to God that it was right, and then like paste that into wherever it would go.
Yeah, so the SQL thing's more of a suggestion. It's not like a hard requirement.
Yeah.
The other thing about data migrations is like you can always just delete them when you're done with them. So that's what's nice about like decoupling it from a database migration is because you need to keep those around. But data migrations, once they happen, you typically don't need to keep them around. So the other thing though is that's a good exercise to learn some SQL.
Yeah.
Because like for me, some of the migrations I wrote, like that really pushed my boundaries of learning like advanced SQL. So I don't know. That's just my experience. There isn't really a wrong way as long as the data gets migrated, right? But there are just gotchas to be considerate of.
Jason, I love you. That was write SQL in the migration. That's so complicated.
Active record base dot connection dot execute and a string of SQL.
Yeah, screw that. Dude, if like a super simple, yeah, you can do that. A super simple, quick thing I would do is like do your migration in your migration folder like normal, and then create a rake task or create like a one-off like Poro that you can just run from the command line. You could also add tester on that too.
I was going to mention too that a thing to be aware of when you do this whole process is like things go wrong. So you'll like write a SQL query that'll like work correctly on your test data or something, but then in production, like something's wrong. Like there's a reference to a deleted record or something.
Sure.
That's the other piece of the whole puzzle that like is important because you want to make sure that like these updates, if you're migrating data around, then you want to make sure that like it can fail gracefully so that you can like retry it and fix your code and like you're not left in a state where things are completely screwed up.
Yeah.
And then I use the strong migrations gem regularly, which will throw an exception whenever you use like rename column or do some sort of like action that's going to lock the entire table, because that will basically stop your database from functioning for as long as it takes to run. So it will give you alternatives that you can use to like do things so that the production database doesn't completely shut down for, a minute or something.
Yeah.
Which is like useful, but it will also, in some of those cases, suggest, like, here's what you need to do. If you're planning on migrating this data, you should do one migration to add your new column, like write a rake task to move all the stuff over, and then do another deploy and drop the column or whatever, So it's nice to have something like that, like a tool built in to kind of guide you so that you don't because if you don't know, you'll just go do that in development. Works fine.
Yeah.
10 million row database, and you're like, whoa, why is this taking hours? Like, things are bad. Is it safe to cancel this or whatever? You don't want that position.
Yeah. And that's a great example of just like, I don't know what I don't know. So like I've done the migrations affected data in a data migration before, but it's like on my personal apps that have like no more than 1,000 records in the database. And even if something breaks, it's just my app. So it's like no big deal. And when you say the database is locked up, would that be like in a situation where like if I was using Heroku, like I would have to put the site in maintenance mode to do that? Or does it just mean like people are going to go to the site and things are going to be wonky?
Yeah, usually it would be like, the database can't insert a record or something because the table's frozen for a minute. So the database won't allow things to happen. So yeah, users the site wouldn't go down or anything necessarily, but whenever a user tried to do something, they might get a 500 error or something.
Okay. Yeah.
Temporarily or whatever. So those are things that like you could maybe simulate just a bunch of traffic to your local server, and generate 1 million rows and then do something and see if you can like, basically do that locally without downtime. But, that gem has a good README of examples of like, these are just things to avoid in production. Your changes that way are kind of guided because Postgres, has its limitations for certain actions and whatever. So it's a good one to just kind of, you probably aren't going to necessarily need that, that often for your projects for a while. But if you follow that practice, hopefully you're more prepared when it does matter when you do it.
For sure.
So, yeah.
One thing I would add, whether you do a rake task, data migrate, whatever process you use, I would wrap everything in a database transaction.
I'm going to stop you right there. See, I don't even know what that means.
So what happens is it's actually really easy to get from Active Record. It happens at a database level. Essentially, like you could say your model name .connection do, and then put all your stuff like that you need to change in the database. And what happens is if that like raises an exception, it blows up or anything, any like SQL changes it's made, it'll roll back. So like if I had 1,000 records and I got to record 600 and like something was wrong and the migration screwed up, it would not just commit those 600 changes and stop. It would just erase everything.
What was that concept called?
They're called database transactions.
Okay. And now that code, like where would I put that in a rake task?
Yeah, you can put it in a rake task. You can put it if you did do data migrations like through database migrations, you could do it there. Okay. Basically, I mean, you can do that anywhere you write code in Ruby or with Rails.
Okay. Yeah, that's another thing too, is like sometimes this isn't even just Rails specific, but like like when I go in Stack Overflow or something, it'll be like, oh, here's the code you want. And sometimes I'm like, where do I put that? And sometimes it's like WordPress or Jekyll, like something kind of simple. But other times it'll be like Rails. And I'm like, I know that this is PHP or Ruby or whatever. Like I know what language it is, but like, I don't know where to put this sometimes. But think that's just trial and error sometimes with when you're looking stuff up online.
Yeah, I definitely know that. Like when you're, especially with something like Rails, where like it could go in your views and your helpers and your models, your controller, your migrations, whatever, when someone gives you an example, you're like, okay.
Yeah.
I actually saw a comment on the Go Rails forum earlier that someone was using like a path, but they were asking current user dot profile path or something. And it was like, the same kind of like, how do I understand what this path belongs to? Like, where does that live and where can I use it? It's kind of it can be a hard thing to wrap your head around because it's something you have to just, over time you'll understand it. And then you'll understand like, I can use this in my controllers, but not in my models. And, those sorts of things will become hopefully more apparent over time, but it's kind of interesting. And I was going to say too, like when we were talking about database transactions, that is one thing that when you do a save or like an update in your models, those are actually generating database transactions. So you'll see that in the Rails logs, but it doesn't show you that it's running a transaction. It just shows you the query. But you will see that if there's a rollback or a commit in the logs, because that is basically saying, hey, this transaction, let's stop and roll back everything that we've done in memory. And so Rails is kind of using that in places already for you. You just don't even need to know about them most of the time, which is kind of funny.
Yeah.
Nate Hopkins just slid into our Zoom call and our DMs and mentioned that, like Rails database migrations. Let's see here. Yeah, they do. I guess if the database supports it, it actually does a transaction already. And if you use that Rails data migrate gem, it also does transactions by default, I believe. And the other cool thing about that is it gives you up and down migrations for your data. It's like, it's useful for me because if I've deployed something out and I screwed up, I can run like Rails DB data rollback or whatever. And I just have to write the appropriate like code, put the state back where it was in the database. So
here's one that I don't know the answer to. Am I supposed to, and this could be a huge security vulnerability for my 10 user applications, but like how often am I supposed to be updating my gems, if at all? And I understand like there are security releases for gems and Rails and whatnot, but like, am I supposed to be doing that like every day? Because I feel like every day there could be like a new release of something. So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that.
I would personally say, that if it's not specific, like there's a security release, you're going to know about it because GitHub will tell you like on your repo, and I think they also will send you a notification. So if there's like some gem in your project that is vulnerable to a security release, so you honestly don't have to update anything unless you get that. And you could stay on lower versions of Rails or Ruby if you wanted to, but you just have to keep in mind that eventually they're going to be not supported anymore. And you probably don't want to find yourself in an unsupported Rails or Ruby version, but like you don't need to be on Rails 6. Like you can be on Rails 5, but I think that's personal preference. Like Nate and I ride pretty close to edge, but I've worked at companies that did not at all. So I think it's kind of up to you.
Okay.
Yeah, I keep mine up to date. Maybe once a month I'll go through and check and see like, because a lot of it where you can get bit is, you want to make sure you get security updates as regularly as they come out, which GitHub, is good about notifying you automatically for, which is great. But then there's like feature updates or something where like the Webpacker gem just released version 5. Do I need to upgrade? Not necessarily. But if you don't and you end up having code that is tied to the version 4 that you're on and you didn't realize it, it's going to be hard at some point when there's like, Rails version 5 is deprecated, not getting security updates anymore, and some big security thing came out, then you're in for some trouble and you've got to upgrade to Rails 6 because then you're tied into some old version that you got to rewrite some code and whatever. So I kind of like to keep an eye on what's going on. So if there's a major version of something, I'll just look at it and see what's going on with it. If it's not a hard upgrade, maybe they're just dropping support for something old, like an older Ruby or something, then I'll go ahead and upgrade it if it's not going to require code changes. But the ones that do require code changes are probably the ones that are going to hold you back from updates at some point. And those pile up, and then it becomes a real pain, like a nightmare to go and upgrade some old app, So I don't know. I try and keep an eye on it, but I'm not really too worried about it as long as I'm not 2 years old or something,
Okay.
2 major Ruby Rails versions behind or whatever,
Okay. It seems kind of actually similar to like other CMSs or frameworks. So like I said, my background is like WordPress and Drupal, and not that those are the same types of things, but like in the WordPress ecosystem, or Drupal might be a better example. So in the Drupal ecosystem, there's the concept of modules, and those are just gems basically. And in the Drupal ecosystem, every Wednesday is when they release any security updates or feature updates. And yeah, like if I were to have just not done those for like an entire year, it'd be a pain in the butt because it would be a huge jump from whatever version I was on to the most current version. So it sounds like, at least conceptually at a high level, that applies to Rails and probably other software, which is just, you should try to update if you can, but it's not like a hard set requirement. Like every week you got to be like running bundle update or whatever.
Yeah. And it's not at all like, if you spend all your time doing that, then, it's not productive. As long as you're keeping up to date with the security stuff, and then you just really want to be aware of the other things that are going to require code changes, which is like over time, if you get bit by too many of those, like you add lots of gems to your apps, over time, you're going to realize like, oh, it's a real pain to keep up to date with these. So you'll probably just, gravitate towards using less gems and trying to build stuff, more from scratch as you need it. Or whatever, which generally when you write it from scratch, you're not doing too much stuff that's like Rails version specific, which is good, because that's what you are just trying to avoid. Because ideally, you could just like upgrade to Rails 6 and the gems would be updated and you'd be good to go. But, there's always these weird, for a good example is like administrate, the admin, the ERD gem. It was one I was looking at this morning. It is not fully up to date with Rails 6 yet, so it doesn't eager load all of your classes when it generates the diagram. So it'll like generate a diagram for like 3 models instead of like all of your models. So it's kind of funny to see that stuff. And it's like, well, if we depend on that, then it's going to force us to stick with this until we fix the gem, which is not fun. Like you are then maintaining other people's code just to keep your app up to date. So it can be a pain because then if they go silent and they're not maintaining it, you've got to run your fork and maintain that yourself. And you can't get help from other people and updates, and becomes a pain. So yeah, it's just one of those things that like over time you find a balance of where you want to be on that, but it's not too bad.
Okay, cool. That's good. So I've been doing stuff in Rails 6, but when I first learned it was Rails 5. So I was used to like the asset pipeline, and just like when you spin up a new scaffold or resource, like it gives you like the SCSS and the JavaScript for that particular model. But now I know everything is pretty much in Webpacker. And conceptually, I get what Webpacker is doing. So correct me if I'm wrong, but it's managing your client side code, right? Like JavaScript, obviously, CSS, like, React, Stimulus, all those things Webpacker is just kind of like taking care of and spitting out, right?
Yeah, it's really like the same thing as the asset pipeline did. It was doing the same stuff, but it's using the JavaScript tools to do it instead of the the asset pipeline tools. So yeah, it helps because you can just pull out. It used to be that people would write a gem that would include some JavaScript in it, and then you'd install a gem to add the bootstrap JavaScript or CSS. And it's like, well, all that JavaScript is in a node module already.
Right.
You can't easily add that to the asset pipeline. So by moving to Webpacker, you can use the tools the JavaScript community is already using to manage that. And there's not a whole lot of reason for us to duplicate all that work. Might as well use the same thing,
Okay.
And we get advantages of all that too. So now we can install node modules rather than maintaining a separate Ruby package around JavaScript or whatever, which is not great.
Yeah. Okay. So that makes sense. And I can appreciate that. One thing I guess I struggled with at first was like, I liked how the asset pipeline, at least when you ran a generator or whatever, like it would give you separate JavaScript files for each of your records. So like, and then I was under the impression that like it would only load that particular JavaScript if you were viewing like one of the RESTful route. Like if you were looking at like the show page for a note, like the JavaScript that has to do with that page would load there, but not on the show page of a different model. Or is that not even true? Because that's how I thought of it. And maybe
that's a point of confusion I think a lot of people had, which is probably a good reason this has changed, because there is no, like when you load your JavaScript in the browser, the JavaScript's shared across everything, especially in Rails with Turbo Links. All of that is there. There's nothing about like, there's no page specific JavaScript or anything. And really, you don't even want that. Because like with Turbo Links, the point of it is we load all of your JavaScript in all of your CSS so that when you navigate to the next page, we don't need to like load up any specific JavaScript or CSS for that page. It's already ready to go, so we can display it as fast as possible. So you really don't want page specific JavaScript, especially when you think about maintaining some of your code. If you decide to move, your credit card form to a different page, you'd have to go rewrite your JavaScript, if it was like specific to a page or something, which would be kind of dumb, And there's no reason that you can't treat your JavaScript as, hey, if we apply it to this HTML, that's what it's going to work with. And we don't really care what page it's on, So it makes your JavaScript less dependent on little details of your app, which is a good thing because you can go move stuff around and be free to do that without breaking things. So that's really what you want. And I think it was kind of because they, generally those files you would just use to organize stuff that's specific to those features, really. So if you have users, you might have JavaScript specific to users, and that might be where you'd put it in that file. But really, you want to think about it as features, So you might have a feature for a user, but whatever. Yeah.
Gotcha. Until right now, until you explained that, I thought prior to Rails 6, it just was like page specific JavaScript, which obviously I can see how that would be a problem. But it sounds like it was just more of like a way to organize the code. But at the end of the day, you're going to get one JavaScript file and all of that's going to get injected into the file. Okay. So Webpacker is doing the same thing then. Because my question was going to be, well, how do I do page specific stuff in Webpacker like the way it was in Rails 5? But the answer is it wasn't like that. It's still going to spin out your bundled file. And
there's cool things that you can do with Webpacker, like split it out so that it'll like lazy load features.
Yeah.
So for example, like 99% of your users won't need the admin area JavaScript, but you can set it up so that it's all compiled in one file, but lazy loaded so that like it'll be in multiple files, and then your JavaScript doesn't really have to care, but it'll lazy load that when it's needed. Cool. So you can do, more advanced things with it like that. But like generally, you don't need to worry about that too much. So yeah, for the most part, it works exactly the same as it did before, mostly.
Okay, cool. I got like career questions too, if you don't mind if I ask some of those.
Yeah.
Because like I said, I'm sort of in a crossroads where like I have enough experience, right, to maybe get like an interview or something, but I've only worked by myself. So like I don't have really experience with working on a development team, doing pull requests. There's words like Scrum and Agile thrown all over. I don't know what those things are. I feel like I should know what they are. So I just feel, and I feel like there's probably a lot of people like me too who are like, they do agency work, but they want to become software engineers. They don't want to go back to school to do it because, through resources online and a few hobby projects, you can at least get a decent understanding of like how to do things. But I feel like it's like a catch-22. I feel like the best way to learn this, like you said in the beginning, is like if you're already on a team, you're just going to learn so much quicker. But the hard part is getting on that team so that you can get the wheels in motion. So I'd just be curious to know like how you guys were able to like get your foot in the door and like just how to kind of break through.
I was in a really similar spot to you. So my first thing is that I think you already have a good advantage because you have an agency job. Like I know you're wanting to like step into like, I assume doing like more application development versus like marketing sites.
Yeah.
But like that was actually the hardest part for me was getting into that agency job. For me, was a little bit of luck because I had connections with a job that did Ruby actually in my city. One of now probably the only company that does Ruby in my city. And for me, like, I think what helped me get not only that relationship, but like I just do what you're doing. Like I threw just a bunch of stuff at the wall, like building side projects, and I would make them like open source, like not that I expect anyone to use it, but so people could see like I had proficiency and like I did know how to build things. And like the nice thing about GitHub or just Git in general is like you can also kind of see how someone thinks when they're building something. Like you can see the steps they've taken. And so it's not really actionable because you're doing a lot of those things, but I would encourage you to keep doing them and try to make connections the best you can with people who are, in the Ruby world, people who are managers, people who are just employees. Like, and my other thing would be, I have a friend who recently just went through a boot camp and got a programming job. And my advice to him was just apply as much as you can to places that are doing Ruby. Even if you don't think you have a shot, like the interview experience can teach you a lot too. That's what I got.
Appreciate that. Yeah. And that's another thing too, is like when I look for jobs, and you guys have mentioned this on the show before too, but it's all like senior Rails developer. And it's like, there's no, like, I know I'm not a senior Rails developer, but like, there's no junior positions either. And part of the problem is like, I'm very passionate about Rails. Like I'm not as passionate about all the, like there's so many more like React jobs and like JavaScript jobs. But I'm just not like, well, one, I also don't know those things necessarily that well either. So it's not like I could just choose to do that if I wanted to, but I want to focus on Rails and Ruby, but I don't see as many jobs out there. And I'm looking at like remote stuff too. It's not like I'm just limiting myself to like my geographic location. I don't know, like what are your thoughts on the job market? Like, are they just saying senior, hoping seniors apply, and then like they're like, Steve applied, he's nice enough. Well, like we tried for some seniors, but this guy applied. Let's give him a shot. Like I don't know how this stuff works.
A lot of times places will say they're looking for seniors and they actually are only looking for seniors. But if they can't find a senior, because it's really hard to find a good Rails senior developer because they're in high demand. So if you come in and you interview, even if you're not a senior, but they haven't found a senior and you're at a level that they think is like that they can work with and they can teach you and level you up so that if they can see senior potential in you, I would say then, yeah, they're going to say senior, but you still have a shot. And like Jason said, it's really good experience to just try to interview. Or the other thing I would say is that I have gotten the majority of jobs in my life, or even job like offers, just from kind of Jason said, like network and meeting people. So, I mean, podcasting was a big thing for me. If I hadn't, Jason Sweat had a podcast called the Rails Testing Podcast. And I did basically the same thing you did. I reached out to him and I was like, hey, dude, I'm a junior. I have questions. Can I come on the show, please? And I didn't expect him to say yes, but he did. And after that, he also encouraged me to, I wanted to be on Ruby Rogues. He encouraged me to reach out to Chuck, and that's how I got on Ruby Rogues. And if I hadn't done that, I would never have met Nate. And Nate and I asked him some questions about a gem he was working on one day. And he asked me if I wanted to pair. And we've been pairing ever since. And now I work with him. So like working in the open is like step one, like being involved in the Go Rails community. Someone in the Go Rails community the other day messaged me and asked me if I wanted a job. Like I didn't know who it was. I don't even really remember his name, but I was like, no, but like, thank you. So like being involved in the community, doing podcasts, or just working in the open, like writing blog posts or working on open source, asking people if they want to pair, trying to, like get like a friend group, I guess, like of online friends. That's kind of what I've done with the people in this call. And like the other day, Jason and I paired on something random, and it's a great learning experience. And when you like develop those relationships and those people know that you're looking for a job, and then they know that you're capable of like performing the job, they're going to be thinking about you. And I think that's like, I think that's like key. Just making sure that people know that you're trying to find a job. And the Ruby and Rails community is awesome for the most part. From now on, like I'm going to be thinking like if I ever see someone with a junior position, I'm going to be like, oh, Steve, I wonder if Steve's found a job. So,
right
yeah,
on,
like,
man. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Continue to build like those relationships, continue working in the open. And yeah, I think it'll come. Just it's hard work. It's not easy, but yeah, like you just have to keep doing it.
Yeah, and I should actually thank you because you are the inspiration for me asking to go on the show. Because way back when you were first on the show, you had mentioned how you just straight up asked people, hey, can I go on your podcast? And I thought, hey, maybe I should just do that. Why not? It's like low risk. If they say no, no big deal. And if they say yes, then it's pretty cool because now I'm here doing it.
And a lot of people aren't going to take that initiative, like to even do that. So like just asking and not being afraid of rejection, I think is like something that holds a lot of people back from potentially being able to get an opportunity that would really help them in life. But they're afraid of like asking people for things, like because they're afraid they're going to say no or that they're going to be a bother or something. Just do it. If you sent me an email and you were like, hey man, I don't know, I want to be on your podcast, or I would love to like get on a Zoom call and ask you some questions about my app, I would totally do that. And I think all of us in this call probably would, like time permitting. So yeah, like I said, build those connections and find people who will hack on stuff with you and work on open source. Or if you see like a gem maintainer or someone who's doing like a project on GitHub or something, and ask them if you can help and ask them if they'd be willing to pair with you maybe. Because I bet a lot of them would. Some of them won't, but a lot of them probably will.
Right, yeah. And it's back to your point. It's not being afraid of the rejection. So if I ask them and they say no, it's the only way I'm going to find out, regardless. So yeah, and I think that would benefit me too. Because like I said, I'm the only dev at my agency. So I don't have any other options. So I have to reach out to the community. Like you said, it's good advice.
That's actually how Chris and I met.
Yeah.
I was just
way back when
a lonely developer in Memphis. And I just emailed Chris asking, because I think I knew you were in St. Louis and Rails Conference in Kansas City. And I was like, hey, you go? And you're like, no, but I'll drive up there. And so he was like, drove up and we had beers and
because I didn't really know you at all. And I was like, you know what? Screw it. I'm going to drive 4 hours and have a beer with this guy and like see what happens. And here we are. So yeah, for sure. Those are like, that's some good advice because those are like the best connections with people that I've ever had. Those random, random things we did and turn into long time friendships and jobs and whatever else, And I think a lot of people talk about it's who you know a lot of times. And it's just, you want to find people who, and these are going to be the best jobs too, people you're friends with. You want to work with those people. So, and they want to help you. So, if you can't work with them, they're going to refer you to jobs and whatever else. And it's a lot of weight because a lot of times, like, yeah, you might not be a senior, but you apply for a job that's for a senior Rails dev. They're just looking for someone who can eventually be a senior. You don't necessarily have to be right at this moment. But if you can learn to be that and they can see that, or they know that from a referral, that makes a big difference.
Actually, also want to piggyback off something Andrew said earlier that you just reminded me of. Because he said, like, a lot of people are looking for senior developers and they like mean they are. I think a lot of people are looking for senior developers, but they're actually not looking for senior developers. Like, they think they are. And I think there's a lot of companies that aren't really like, so I don't know. I think it's worth applying, even if you don't think you get it. It's kind of like putting yourself out there to meet people. It's the same thing for the job application process. Like, just put yourself out there. The worst is you get all the way to the interview process and they say no.
Right. Yeah. And that's how I'm looking at it. Maybe I just need be more aggressive with and just cast a very wide net because it's a very low risk. Like if I'm not right for the job, then I have faith that the application process would reveal that, So I think I should cast a wide net, just go after more things.
And you got to go out of your comfort zone for a lot of this because when I think I've said this in the past, but when I first met Chris and Jason, we were all at RailsConf and Chris put on Twitter like something like, I have Go Rails stickers. I'm upstairs. If you want a sticker, come pick one up. And I am like not a sociable being. Like you could say shy. I don't know. Not when I open up, but like that was very outside of my comfort zone. That was like, I was like kind of like pacing like back and forth for a minute. Like, oh, like, what if this, what if that? At the end of the day, like most of those thoughts that you kind of start running through in your head aren't going to happen in anyway. Like, so I walked upstairs and sat down with Chris and Jason, and I met other Andrew who runs Bullet Train and Andrew Famera and Kevin Diaz, who has the Prettier Ruby library.
God, how many Andrews were at that table?
There were a lot. It was a collective Andrew mindshare.
I remember this.
Yeah, me too. Yeah. I remember specifically thinking like, oh, cool. He like took the time to come up here. Like that's somebody I need to like, chat more with because no one else is really doing that. So it was a sign like this guy's probably interesting or somebody I should talk to more.
And then you met me.
Yeah. So here we are. Now you're a host on the podcast. Like,
yep.
Wouldn't have thought about that a year ago. So that's pretty crazy.
Yeah. Because I was in the same place as you a year ago, Steve. Like I listened to Chris and Jason on this podcast all the time. And I didn't think I would have ever shown up on it, but here I am.
Yeah, right on. Yeah. And like I said, when I heard that episode where you were just saying, take chances and ask to be on shows, I'm like, yeah, maybe I should. Glad I did.
Yeah, we are too.
Yeah, we're glad to have you on here. I think we're probably getting about to a time where we need to wrap up, but did you have any other last questions you wanted to end with?
No, this was great. I really appreciate everyone taking a chance on me, having me on here. And it was nice just talking to you guys. You answered a lot of questions and it was just nice to talk to other devs for a change.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm not going to speak for the other guys, but feel free to ping me on Slack or Twitter or whatever. And I'm happy to like chat more and pair and answer questions and do whatever. And also listeners of this podcast, if you need a Rails developer, you know where to find one. So hire Steve.
Thanks. I like that.
I would also say if someone's listening and knows of other people or just has advice in general for Steve, like, Steve, do you have a way they can contact you? And
yeah, if you just search Steve Polito Design online, my site will come up, and Steve Polito Design on Twitter as well.
I like these shadows.
Oh, thanks.
Some nice shadows.
Yeah, those are some good shadows.
Nate, do you have anything to say? You've been really chatty this episode.
Well, I dropped in like partway through. Just on the applying everywhere strategy. The one thing that I would say is a lot of tech hiring practices are pretty terrible. So don't beat yourself up if you like bomb a few interviews, because frankly, I'd say 90% of the time that's not going to be your fault. It's just going to be the kind of the culture of tech hiring right now. It's not great.
Okay, appreciate that.
That's super true. Especially like it's really sad to see Avdi, interviewing for jobs and he can't find something good. He's got to be one of the best Ruby developers there is out there, and he's struggling to find a job. So it just takes time to find something that fits with you, and you will also be able to tell pretty quickly, in the interview process whether the company's good or not as well on how they run it. And you should be interviewing them as much as you can. Like use it as a thing to find out if you're going to be a good fit. Are these people you want to hang out with and like learn as much as you can from? That's what you're looking for,
Yeah.
Cool. Well, you guys have anything else before we wrap up?
We can talk about more next week, but when Andrew said that we paired this weekend, I migrated off action text, and that was a process.
Oh yeah, I forgot you were going to be doing that. You're moving to, what was the name of the WYSIWYG that you're using instead? Redactor. It's
a paid WYSIWYG, but it's pretty cool. We can talk more about it next week, but it was, other than image uploading, which is just always a pain, how you do it, where you do it, it's pretty slick. So that'd be something fun to talk about.
Cool. I look forward to hearing more about that.
And he added Haml.
I think we were on the same session.
He was committing stuff that you didn't know about.
Yeah.
I was pretty tired. I may have just started dreaming of a happy place.
That was a dream. There's no doubt. Well, cool. It was good to catch up, Steve. It was nice to meet you, and appreciate you.
Yeah, it's good to meet you.
Hanging with us.
Thank you very much, guys. It was great to meet all of you. Thanks again for having me.
Yeah, and I would say you're well on your way to putting yourself out there. I mean, to just come on a podcast, that's a big step. So kudos and good luck, and let us know if we can do anything.
For sure. You've already done so much, so I appreciate it, guys. Thank you.
All right. Well, everyone, we'll see you next week.
All right. See ya.
Yeah. Bye.
This podcast is brought to you by our friends at Linode. With 11 data centers worldwide, including their newest data center in Sydney, Australia, enterprise-grade hardware, S3-compatible storage option, and their next-generation network, Linode delivers the performance you expect at a price that you don't. Get started on Linode today by going to linode.com/remote Ruby.